Today we're going to talk about imperative forms. These are forms used to give commands or to make requests. For instance, we could say, "Come here, please." "Don't touch that." "Please have a seat." "Help yourself to the nachos." Notice in each of these that there is actually no subject. That's what makes them imperative as opposed to interrogative, question forms, or indicative, normal statement forms. The hallmark of imperative forms is the implied subject. In other words, the person doing or not doing the action is not actually present in the sentence. For the sake of argument, let's look at the same general ideas phrased differently. These may be polite, socially acceptable ways to get people to do things you want them to do. Some are questions and some are polite statements indicating a request, but they each contain a subject, so they're not actually imperative forms. Now, as you might have guessed, German has several different ways of making imperative forms, depending on who you're addressing. If you have to worry about which word you use for you or your in German, then you can be sure you'll also have to be careful about which command form to use, depending on whether you're talking to someone you'd address as du, ihr, or sie. Let's say you were talking to someone you'd address with du. One friend or family member. In other words, someone you'd call by their first name. Here's how you would formulate a command for this singular, informal situation. First of all, you would conjugate the verb that you want to use for du. Then, you'd remove the st ending from the verb, and finally, you'd put what's left first in your sentence without the word du. Let's use the example of the verb mähen, which means to mow. The du form would be du mähst. But we don't want the du, and we don't want the st ending either. So we get rid of those and are left with mäh. Put that at the beginning of our command, and we get something like mäh den Rasen. And in fact, if we wanted to be polite, we could toss a bitte on there. But let's not be polite. Let's try with another verb. This time, we'll use the verb gehen. Again, we'll conjugate our verb for du, remove du and the st ending, and then we'll put what's left at the beginning of the command. Good, we were a little more polite here. Let's see that process again with another verb. This time we'll use kaufen, to buy. Again, conjugate, remove the du and the st, and then put what's left, kauf, at the beginning of the resulting command that you make. Now, at this point you might be saying to yourself, "Gee, self, all I need to do is use the verb stem. Why go to all the trouble of conjugating and then getting rid of the st ending?" Well, let's use another example. This time, we'll use nehmen. As you might recall, nehmen is a stem-changing verb, so watch what happens. The du form of nehmen is du nimmst. We eliminate the du and the st, and we're left with nimm. This goes at the beginning of our command, not the stem of the infinitive verb. So let's add another rule up top. If the verb is a stem-changing verb, you're going to want to keep that stem change in the command form. But there's an exception to that rule too. If the stem change was just adding an umlaut, then you take it back off when you make a command. As an example of that last exception, let's use the verb laufen, because that adds an umlaut for a stem change. Laufen becomes du läufst. We get rid of the du and the st, as usual, but we're also going to get rid of the added umlaut that we added due to the stem change. And so we end up with Lauf Ski im Winter as our command. No stem change anymore. Let's move on to plural informal commands. In other words, when you're talking to two people, two or more people, who you'd address by their first name. Plural command forms are actually much simpler than singular informal command forms, because there will be no weird stem changes involved. All you need to do is conjugate the verb for ia, then put that verb first in your command, but again, without the word for you. So we're going to eliminate the word ia. For instance, if we use the verb machen, the ia form of that would be ia macht. We eliminate ia, but we keep the ending, and we put macht at the beginning of our command, as in macht das Bett. The same process works with the verb holen, which means to get or fetch. Holen becomes ihr holt, which then becomes holt in our command. So your command could be holt 1 Kilo Äpfel. Now let's move on to formal command forms. As with all things formal, take this one very seriously, because German speakers take it very seriously. But this one is also very simple to construct. First, we're going to conjugate the verb for sie, the formal form. And in fact, this will almost always just be the infinitive form. Then, we're going to put the verb first in the command as usual, but this time we're going to keep the word sie right after the verb form. For instance, take the verb schauen. Conjugated, this would be sie schauen. We'll reverse the order for our command, and we end up with something like Schauen Sie dort drüben. With the verb gießen, the process is the same. First we conjugate, then we switch the order, but we keep the sie, and you can create a command that goes something like Gießen Sie die Blumen. One word of warning. There are verbs out there that have separable prefixes. But, as is the case when you use them in a regular old statement, the prefix will just go at the end of the clause when you make a command with one of these verbs. For instance, if you were to use anziehen, the an would be at the end, as in zieh eine warme Jacke an, or ziehen Sie bitte einen Hut an, for a formal command. If you use the verb aussehen, the aus would be at the end, with the rest of the verb conjugated appropriately for the type of command you're making. Sieh nicht so traurig aus, seht heute Abend sehr schick aus, ja? Finally, let's review. To make command forms, which are different than questions or polite requests that actually include the subject rather than just implying it, you need to first figure out who you are addressing. If it's one person you are on an informal basis with, then you'll use the du form minus its st ending. If you're addressing two people informally, you'll use the ia form. And if you're addressing someone formally, someone you'd call by their last name, you'll use the z form followed by the word z.